Hey everyone, John with Hardline here. This video is part 1 of the series We Live in Darwin's Universe. There will be more on the way. This one is on politics, and the next will be about ecology. It's mostly coming as a response to the environmentalism-inspired critique of market economics, namely the critique which claims that capitalism is wrong for working under the premise that the economy would be able to grow forever. While this might be old news to some viewers, to those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, one of the main premises in market economics is that productivity and wealth always grow. Everyone from investors to business people to bankers, as well as many academics, work under the assumption that the economy will always keep growing. This is indeed such a strongly and commonly held belief that formally, the economy is considered in a recession whenever it's not growing, and many consider it a recession simply when it is growing slower than usual. The foundation of the critique holds that wealth and productivity need to come from somewhere. We need resources, and at the end of the day, everything we use on a daily basis is made from minerals, plants, or animals. Even with most chemicals, when we trace them to their points of origin, they either come from some kind of plant or some kind of mineral. The world, as well as its ecosystem, are finite, so at some point, the critic's perspective would be that there must be a hard limit to growth. Here is where I'm going to come in and argue that the real case is that yes, there will always be growth. There might be recessions, and there might even be periods of major decline in aggregate productivity. But the expansionist model has, and most likely always will, continue to be the best representation we have of how the world works. To start with the issue of limited real estate, the world is only so big, and we can only use so many of its resources. However, the fact that the amount of intake to the system is limited does not automatically mean that there's a point at which it will as a whole stop growing. To put it in simple terms, while the Earth has a finite amount of gases and minerals, it will continue to receive energy from the sun for several billion more years. While we cannot efficiently turn the energy from the sun directly into useful things, we will be able to use its energy to turn the world's atmosphere as well as its minerals into useful things for at least the foreseeable future. At the same time, most of where growth comes from is from scientifically based improvements to efficiency. Some of the easiest places to look in order to see this are either automotive or agricultural technologies. Crop technology lets us get more food from less land every few years, and improvements to engines let us get more power from less fuel every year. So while there is a limited amount of land in the world, there are more minerals and there is more air than we will actually be able to use up for a long time. While there is evidence that the changing composition of the atmosphere has effects on its behavior, these effects are possible to mitigate. Given it's a very heated debate, I will not get into the question of whether or not humans are the sole cause of climate change, but there is doubtless evidence that we are indeed changing the composition of the atmosphere, as well as clear evidence that people are the most influential modern force affecting the ecosystem. To verify that last one, all you really need to do is log into Google Maps and take a look around any random point on the world and see that most of the terrain has in some way been altered by people. With all said, people often forget how resilient we actually are. There are currently people living on nearly every patch of land in the world. There are next to no islands left larger than a square mile that do not have permanent settlements on them. What this might tell some people is that the world is filling up, but to me it just says that people can live almost anywhere. If you live in or have been to the United States, the country has the same population density as the average of all habitable land in the world. That means on average, the world is no more crowded than the US. If you live in New York, this might seem busy, but it's easy to forget that all of those flyover states not only have very few people in them, but are also huge. In a lot of them, you can buy 3 acres of land for the same price as a month's rent in a downtown apartment. So what am I getting at here? Essentially, people have proven capable of living everywhere, and the main worry pertaining to the whole climate change problem is that there may be crop failures and storms. Some places are expected to get drier and others wetter, some hotter and others cooler. If the trends continue and the predictions come true, a lot of people will be inconvenienced, and the consequences for many will likely be disastrous. But here's the thing, many people will adapt, and some will even thrive in the new landscape. Now, why am I even talking about this? Through any kind of change that we might expect to see, technology will keep improving, and it will be very unlikely to ever go backwards. Books were delicate and hard to copy. However, today, despite that the sum of all human knowledge could never conceivably be printed out, copying major elements of what we know onto multiple backups is cheaper and faster than ever. When we look at people's history on the long term, a trend emerges that most statesmen, as well as business people, accept as law. Technology translates into productivity and growth translates into influence. In other words, whoever is best at expanding leads. This is important because it means that the only way we can go as a species is forward. Some individuals can go backwards, but they will not be noticed, fall behind, and eventually be forgotten. Economically, culturally, and in the cases of nations, militarily. I might sound harsh saying this, but this is a wide-held belief among academics as well as among the people who make foreign policy decisions for most of our countries. Despite the tone, though, it's not necessarily a bad thing. For the most part, while every era has unique problems to solve, going forward makes life better. I like the internet, central heating, cars, planes, modern medicine, and all of the things that come with modernity. If I lived in the Bronze Age, I likely would have also very much appreciated metal tools. Most people at the time clearly did as well. Where it might still sound harsh even after further explanation is when we talk about how the growth model affects politics. To summarize, the most powerful country is the one with the most industry and the most science. It gets those things by being open to research, as well as having attitudes that prioritize growth. What this means is that their attitude is expansionist, be it economically or militarily. If their neighbors do not share this mindset, then they will pressure them to become an ally or at least an asset to them. One of the best examples are foreign influences for resources in poor countries. Some call it colonialism, others call it globalism, and others refer to it as free trade. Whether these relationships are mutually beneficial often depends on the relative equality of the two parties, and in many cases the attitude of the stronger one. If two parties are on equal footing, the relationship will almost always have to be mutual. However, if one is significantly more powerful, either in terms of bartering ability or ability to coerce, then the stronger one sets the terms of the agreement. In each case, though, the economy as a whole, even when it consists of several smaller economies, will always be steered towards behavior that maximizes growth. In other words, the only way to go is forward. The world will always keep getting bigger, faster, busier, and smarter. And if we try to go backwards, then we will lose influence over the people who use technology to its fullest and work to develop more. With all that said, people still have a level of say in terms of how to go about it, as well as what elements in growth to prioritize, but our individual level of influence depends entirely on what we can buy, who we can convince, and whether we can speak as groups. This is one of the main reasons that I'm a big fan of decentralized systems, politically, economically, technically, and geographically. Whenever anything is concentrated around powerful hubs, power, money, or information, then people of that system have proportionally less say in decisions at levels of management above them, even when those decisions affect them directly. Say we take growth as a given, all that really means is that the world will always keep getting more technological, more industrialized, and that there's a good chance it will always keep getting more populated. This has some downsides, as I mentioned in climate change, but I would say that the effect is on the whole to our benefit. However, the more centralized the system becomes, the rougher the road will be. Here's why. First, centralization and interconnection are two very different things. To be interconnected means that one part can reach out and influence any other part. This is trading, phone calls, emails, and all other types of peer-to-peer sharing. On the other hand, when something is centralized, this means that there's a pronounced hierarchy where the central element has more power outwards than other elements have inwards. While the power in any system is derived from all elements, when we look at systems involving people, an important part of any power structure is decision-making. In a perfect world, everyone's voice would be heard by the necessary level of management whenever they had something relevant to say. However, centralization implies that the top of the hierarchy are not only making the most important decisions, but also the most decisions. When this happens, not only can peers be disconnected, but higher levels are unable to process grievances from people under them. This leads not only to an unpleasant system to inhabit, but also an unstable one. To start with the unpleasant, we have the issue of censorship in modern-day social networks. While I don't think it's reached an extreme yet, the people who run the networks can both control the flow of information, as well as potentially distort it to make it look like most users support them controlling it. At the same time, they can limit discussions about their decision to control it so that users cannot become organized enough to affect what they, the operators, do. Some would call this malicious, but I would lean on the optimistic side and call it an unbalanced system. More elements in a system make it smarter, but if all the key decisions have to pass through a few of those elements without proper participation by everyone else who's a part of it, then the system as a whole can often make poor decisions. The solution then is to maintain decentralization while also always working to build interconnections and ways of organizing those connections then. In the long run, as many people before me have said, any of these types of issues eventually work themselves out, but the more centralized the system in question is, be it political, economic, or information-based, then the more tumultuous the solution ends up being. Take a political system, for example. When we have a democratic system, power is to an extent decentralized. When leaders make poor decisions, people vote them out. The main hassle then is the consequence of their decisions while in office, and the burden it might put on the people who replace them in office. On the other hand, say we have a dictatorship. Even if the leader means well, they can still make mistakes, and historically they often have. Once people have had enough, they will often find a way to oust them, but since power is concentrated at a central hub, they cannot simply ask, and the debate over whether or not the leadership should step down has often escalated to conflict. Today, we live in an age where it should, in theory, be easier than ever to maintain highly interconnected political, economic, social, and information systems, which are also not too centralized. Democracy was practiced in almost every nomadic tribe, and logistics was the main limiting factor in how large they could become. At the same time, it was idealized by some Bronze Age states, but also always deemed impractical, given that most people at the time couldn't access enough information to make good decisions, nor could they conveniently submit their opinions. Modern-style democracy then developed alongside the printing press and the telegraph. Given how much more efficient modern tech is than something like book copying and newspapers, it seems long overdue that the system of today becomes even more democratic, so to speak, than it currently is. In some ways, I think it's probably inevitable, but how smooth the transition is depends on how proactive we are as the people. With the right execution, it should, in my eyes, be possible to make the world freer, fairer, wealthier, and safer through a process of discussion and institutional reform. On the other hand, if we're complacent, it wouldn't surprise me to see it continue on the uncertain path it is until today's central hubs mismanage things to the point of a complete turnover. Even that, I think, would be more smooth than a lot of people expect, but there's a good chance as well that it would not be. If you have been keeping up with headlines, there are a good number of hot-button issues these days that some journalists like to predict might even threaten the foundations of our political institutions. I personally tend to dismiss them as clickbait and attention-seeking, but if we think they have a shimmer of a point, then that should be, for most of us, an incentive to begin working towards reform and conciliation while it still has the potential to be easy. In my readings of history, most conflicts have often been between two factions who wanted very similar outcomes, but lacked the ability to communicate their common interests. I'll stop there. As always, more videos are on the way. If you like this one, you may also like how preppers can inform a better vision for the future. In it, I don't get into whether or not I think their predictions are onto something. Rather, the main focus is what they imagine they would do if they ever had to rebuild civilization on a fresh start. What I found is that they actually have some really good arguments regarding stability and sustainability that I think are just as, if not more useful when we remove the presupposition of them being in the context of rebuilding. On a final closing note, I'm working on a project that actually involves getting people more interconnected without centralizing things. I'm planning to start a new social network. Given there are a few big flaws I see in how social networks operate today, I think the industry needs a bit of a reboot, so to speak, if it's going to get any more useful. I have a video out on the project titled "It's Time for a New Social Network." Feel free to watch it if you haven't. As always, I need all the help I can get with the project. If you want to collaborate, offer support, or criticize it, ways of contacting me are in the description. In the meantime, thanks for watching.